You were clocked at 61 and a 35. The fine is $525, Judge Miriam Calloway said, without looking up, already flipping to the next file. But the man didn't move. He simply said calmly and clearly, "Before we proceed, Your Honor, I think it's important you know who I am." And in that moment, the entire courtroom held its breath, because what he said next would shift the ground beneath her gavel. It was already past 9 a.m. In courtroom 3C of the Pima County Justice Center in Tucson, Arizona, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead blended with the rustle of legal pads and the occasional shuffle of feet from the benches. Judge Miriam Calloway sat poised behind the bench, her robe smooth and sleeves pressed to every line of her posture, suggesting control, efficiency, and most of all, urgency. At 63, she'd presided over this courtroom long enough to have seen every excuse, every plea, every angle. She didn't waste time, and she didn't tolerate those who did. Her philosophy was simple: move. The docket forward, dispense justice, don't get sentimental. The stack of traffic and municipal violations on her left was thick but familiar. She flipped to the next file with a practiced hand, barely glancing at the name printed in bold: Elias Monroe. She looked up. A tall black man stood. His charcoal gray suit was crisp, his tie-straight briefcase in hand. Not flashy, but deliberate. Everything about him said prepared. His stride was even calm, not the kind of nervous shuffle she'd grown used to. No fumbling with papers. No muttering apologies. He simply took his place at the defendant's stand and waited. Miriam didn't pause. You were clocked at 61 miles per hour in a 35 zone on Keno Parkway. That's nearly double the limit. The fine is $525. You have the option to contest or pay. She didn't look up again. Her pen was already moving across the bottom of the file. A signature, a checkmark, the same rhythm she'd perfected for nearly 30 years on the bench. Business as usual, but the man didn't move. He cleared his throat just enough to be heard, not disruptive. Your Honor, he said, his voice level controlled. Before we conclude, I'd like to offer some context. Miriam looked up, one brow lifting not out of surprise but routine skepticism. This isn't a trial, Mr. Monroe. If you wish to contest the citation, the process is separate. Right now, we're just processing the fine. I understand, he said evenly. I'm not contesting the citation. I accept responsibility for the speed. I only ask that the record reflect why I was traveling that route. She exhaled slowly, more out of habit than annoyance. Go ahead. I was en route to the federal courthouse downtown. I'm Deputy Chief Prosecutor Elias Monroe, and I was scheduled to lead a closed-door strategy session on a federal task force matter, human trafficking across state lines. The original lead counsel was hospitalized that morning. I had to take both segments. The room went still. The bailiff shifted slightly. A woman in the back lowered her phone. Even the courtroom clerk paused, mid-type fingers hovering in the air. Miriam blinked. She recognized the name now. Elias Monroe. She'd seen it at least twice this year in federal circulars and judicial briefings. She remembered a keynote he'd delivered on prosecutorial integrity she hadn't attended, but she'd flagged the video to watch later, never got around to it. And now here he was, standing in her courtroom, being fined like a teenager caught joyriding after curfew. Miriam felt something twist, not embarrassment exactly, not yet, but dissonance. She glanced down at the file again, almost as if it would magically change. But no, the name hadn't shifted. Elias Monroe, Deputy Chief Prosecutor, lead on the cross-state rings case. The man whose voice she'd just silenced with a number and a checkmark. He didn't stand there smugly, didn't raise his voice, didn't flash a badge or drop names. He stood exactly as he had when he entered. Steady, respectful, professional, and somehow that made it worse. The courtroom hadn't erupted. There was no dramatic gasp, no overt reaction, but the shift in energy was palpable. A murmur moved through the room like a current under still water. The bailiff looked her way. The clerk, subtle as ever, shot her a glance that was more question than expression. Everyone had registered what just happened. She could have asked for proof, could have demanded credentials, or brushed it all off as a dramatic deflection. But she didn't. She knew. She knew who he was. She just hadn't bothered to look up until he gave her a reason to. Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Monroe, she said finally, voice low, composed. It sounded like her, but not exactly. There was a hesitation in her tone she wasn't used to hearing. He gave a small nod, nothing theatrical, just acknowledgement. Then he turned to step back from the stand. "You may go," she added, gesturing slightly. As he returned to his seat, the silence cracked open into hushed whispers. A woman near the back leaned toward her neighbor. "That's him," she whispered. "The prosecutor. The big trafficking case. I saw it on the news." Another voice followed lower near the aisle. Can't believe she didn't recognize him. Miriam didn't react. She focused on the next file. Case number 12106B, Naomi Ramirez. The defendant shuffled forward, a girl no older than 17 in an oversized hoodie and faded jeans. Miriam looked at her, but her thoughts weren't in the room. She could still feel the weight of what had just happened, not because Elias Monroe had corrected her, but because he hadn't. He'd let the silence do the work. That restraint, that calm, had more impact than any outburst would have. She tapped her pen against the desk once, twice, then again. The room returned to motion, but inside her something had come to a halt. By noon, the break room had become a quiet echo chamber of half-said things. Not gossip, not quite, but enough sidelong glances and quiet commentary to build a verdict without ever calling for order. Miriam entered with her usual lunch-grilled chicken quinoa salad, a small coffee. She didn't engage in small talk. Never had. Most respected her space. But that didn't stop the conversations from happening just outside her periphery. "Elias Monroe," someone whispered near the vending machine. "I would have folded the docket if I saw his name. Guess she didn't even glance at it. She's been on that bench so long she probably doesn't need to anymore." Miriam heard it all. Not direct, not cruel, but there. She sat at the far end as usual. She didn't eat, just opened the salad lid and stared. For years she'd believed efficiency was integrity, that a fast courtroom was a just one, that her job wasn't to listen, it was to decide. But now she was wondering how many names she'd never really looked at. How many people she'd passed over, not maliciously, just automatically. Reflex. Later in her chambers, she pulled Monroe's file back out. She stared at the thin citation that had somehow become the weight of the entire morning. On paper, it was a speeding ticket. In practice, it had become a moment of reckoning. And Miriam Calloway wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end of a lesson. That afternoon, her rulings were clean, precise, but there was a shift. She looked up more often, asked one or two questions she usually wouldn't. No one said anything, but they noticed. Outside the courthouse, the Tucson sun blazed down on the sidewalk. Elias Monroe stepped through the glass doors, adjusting the strap of his briefcase as his phone buzzed in his pocket. 3 missed calls, 2 texts. A reminder for a DOJ meeting at 2:00 p.m. The day moved forward. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who'd been through this moment more than once, on different days in smaller rooms in quieter ways. And every time he handled it the same way, steady, unshaken, respectful. Because power doesn't need to shout. It just has to stand still long enough for people to realize they missed it. And this time someone finally had. Judge Miriam Calloway sat in her chambers long after the courtroom had emptied. The hum of the overhead light felt louder than usual, like it had grown bolder in the silence. In front of her, Elias Monroe's citation sat on her desk, not tucked into the stack of closed cases where it belonged, but centered as if daring her to look at it again. And she did, again and again. The morning's moment kept looping in her head, the calmness in his voice, the dignity in his posture, the way he never once raised it or leaned on his title. He didn't need to. The air in that courtroom had shifted the moment he said his name, and it hadn't shifted back since. Miriam thought she had seen it all after more than 3 decades on the bench. But what lingered now wasn't just embarrassment, it was the clarity that she hadn't just overlooked a man. She had ignored the presence of someone whose work she deeply respected, someone she would have likely invited to speak on legal ethics had the setting been different. But instead, she'd find him like a kid caught drag racing, and everyone had seen it. Word traveled fast in courthouses, faster than paper files or docket sheets ever could. By lunch, the courthouse cafeteria was humming with restrained murmurs. Not gossip, not really. It was more like professional disbelief, the kind people mutter just loud enough to be heard by the person they pretend they're not talking about. She didn't even ask who he was, someone whispered behind the vending machines. Didn't glance at the file. I would have folded the citation if I saw that name. Miriam didn't respond. She hadn't even turned around. She just sat at her usual table by the window, pushing her fork through a wilted arugula salad she had no intention of eating. The words didn't sting because they were untrue, they stung because they weren't. And what gnawed at her even more was that Elias hadn't done anything to make her feel that way. He hadn't rubbed it in. He hadn't corrected her. He'd simply spoken and let her own assumptions do the rest. Later that afternoon, she opened his record. It wasn't difficult. Judges had access to nearly every legal brief ever submitted through the federal circuit. His name was everywhere. 16 major cases since 2017. 4 of them linked directly to national security interests. The most recent, a task force operation against multi-state human trafficking rings, had involved 6 agencies and nearly 18 months of sealed evidence. His filings weren't just competent, they were surgical. His indictments read like blueprints, every paragraph mapped every fact airtight. She read them the way she used to read legal theory in her early years hungrily. She kept pausing at how balanced they were. Logical, firm, but never performative. She saw in his writing the same precision she'd once prided herself on, before her job became so mechanical she barely read names out loud anymore. When the envelope arrived the next morning, it was plain. No official seal, just a white label from the judicial clerk's office marked review. Inside were 2 pages typed, signed, and dated. The letter was from Elias Monroe. Not a formal complaint, not a request for disciplinary action. It was something rarer, a reflection. During my appearance before Judge Calloway, it began, I was issued a citation without the opportunity to offer any explanation. While I understand the demands of a crowded docket, I believe the moment illustrates a larger need for discretion, especially in fast-moving municipal proceedings. This is not a grievance, only a reminder when systems move faster than people, they tend to flatten nuance. And nuance is where justice lives. She read it 3 times before she breathed. There was no sarcasm, no indignation. It was thoughtful, respectful, unflinching, and for Miriam it was devastating, because it was all true. She'd spent her career upholding the belief that justice was consistency, that the best judges didn't waver, didn't hesitate, didn't indulge delay. She had streamlined her courtroom to a model of efficiency, but that letter laid bare what she'd quietly sacrificed for speed, context, empathy, and sometimes even truth. That night at home, she didn't turn on the TV. She didn't reach for the case book she normally kept beside the recliner. Instead, she pulled out a yellow legal pad and wrote 4 words, "What have I missed?" Then she made a call she hadn't made in years, not to a clerk, not to another judge, but to the number listed at the bottom of the letter. Elias answered after 2 rings. "This is Monroe," he said, voice calm and direct. She swallowed. "Mr. Monroe, this is Judge Calloway." There was a pause, not cold, just curious. "Yes, Judge. I got your letter," she said. "I read it. And I'm calling because you didn't have to write it, but you did. And it landed." Silence stretched, and then he said, "I meant every word," she exhaled softly. "I made a mistake, not in the citation itself, but in how I handled you. I'm not calling today as a judge. I'm calling as a person who forgot to ask a question before making a decision." Another pause. "Then thank you for saying that." Most people wouldn't. They didn't speak much longer. It wasn't a long conversation, but it was real. And when it ended, Miriam stared at the phone in her hand, not quite ready to let go. The following day, she entered her courtroom early, not to prepare files or rehearse opening remarks. She just wanted to sit, alone, to feel the space differently, to look at the seats not as roles but as people. By the time the clerk arrived, she had already marked 2 files for personal review, something she hadn't done in years. That afternoon, she requested a copy of Monroe's opening remarks from a legal summit she'd missed the year prior. The keynote's title, "The Cost of Speed When Prosecutorial Urgency Replaces Judicial Reflection." The irony was not lost on her. His voice on the recording was clear and firm, but never aggressive. He spoke about systems that rewarded speed over accuracy, about how assumptions fill in the blanks when questions aren't asked. She played it twice, took notes. Over the next week, Miriam found herself watching differently, listening longer, not to waste time but to restore meaning to it. She wasn't trying to transform overnight. She just wanted to see, really see, not the files, the people. During a Thursday morning docket, a defendant named Harper Sloan, a 22-year-old nursing student, stood before her with a citation for expired registration. In the past, Miriam would have issued the standard fine and moved on. But this time she asked, "Can you tell me what happened?" The young woman blinked, surprised. Um, my paycheck was late. I've been paying out of pocket for my mom's medications. I just couldn't cover everything." Her voice cracked. Miriam nodded. "Let's work out a payment plan that fits. And I'll waive the late fee. Focus on getting your registration updated. We'll keep this off your record." The woman looked like she might cry. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't a grand act. It wasn't revolutionary. But the courtroom felt lighter after that. The clerk smiled. The bailiff relaxed his stance. The rhythm remained intact, but something had shifted. Miriam had started asking again, not to question the law, but to honor the people standing beneath it. That night she opened Elias's letter one more time. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. But she folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside her bench. Not as evidence, as a reminder. Because the real judgment that day hadn't come from the bench. It had come from a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. The folder sat on the corner of Judge Miriam Calloway's desk, like a quiet challenge. Its tabs color-coded, its edges slightly worn from how many times she'd opened it in the past few days. Elias Monroe's case history, 16 federal prosecutions, each one layered with complexity, coordination, and care. She hadn't opened it again that morning, but she didn't need to. She could still recall every line from the judicial review letter he'd submitted. It wasn't just the words, it was the weight of them. It had been days since she'd picked up the phone and called him, days since she heard his voice steady and clear as she admitted she was wrong. But what lingered wasn't the apology, it was what he said after. Most people wouldn't. That simple truth had stayed with her like a stone in her pocket. She kept touching it not to feel guilt, but to remember what she'd nearly lost her ability to see people as more than lines on a docket. That morning she arrived earlier than usual. She walked the long way in through the side entrance near the records office, past the law library, with its cold quiet and sharp fluorescent light, and then into her chambers. She paused before opening the door hand on the handle, grounding herself. Courtroom 3C was already being prepped. Her clerk had the files laid out. The bailiff was reviewing the security list, and the hum of movement was familiar, but something in Miriam had changed. She wasn't about to throw out procedure or abandon standards, but she wasn't going to speed past people anymore. Not when one of them had reminded her what it means to lead without shouting. The first case was straightforward, a parking violation. But instead of breezing through the file and issuing a fine, she looked up. "Ms. Ackerman," she said, gently but clearly, "you've brought some photos with you today. Would you like to explain them?" The older woman blinked, startled. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I took these because the street sign was hidden behind a construction banner, and I didn't see the no parking notice." Miriam nodded and took the photos from the clerk, studying them without rushing. She ruled in the woman's favor, not out of pity, but because the evidence was sound. The woman's shoulders dropped in visible relief. "Thank you," she whispered. Miriam offered a short, sincere nod. "You're welcome." The morning continued with a different rhythm. A 22-year-old nursing student named Tasha Lambert appeared for expired registration. Her file said late payment, no prior history, full-time student with 2 part-time jobs. Miriam could have fined her and moved on, but instead she looked her in the eye. "Ms. Lambert," she said, "can you tell me what caused the delay in renewal?" Tasha's hands fidgeted. "My paycheck was short that week. I've been helping my mom cover her insulin, and I figured I could wait a few days before updating my registration. I know I messed up." Miriam let the silence breathe before responding. "Thank you for your honesty," she said. "We'll waive the late fee, set a payment date for the base fine, and update your registration by the end of the week. No points on your record." Tasha looked stunned. "Really, really," Miriam replied. "Drive safe." By lunchtime, the energy in the courtroom had shifted, subtle but undeniable. The clerks moved with a touch more ease. The public defenders looked slightly less defensive. Even the bailiff, usually stone-faced, cracked a half-smile when a young man thanked him for holding the door. Miriam didn't comment on it. She didn't need to. The courtroom didn't feel softer. It felt more aware, and it was contagious. That afternoon, she saw the shoplifting case, a 16-year-old boy named Julian Webb. The file said first offense, no prior juvenile record. The item, a package of baby formula, His mother sat in the gallery, her hands wringing a folded tissue, eyes never leaving her son. Julian stood with his shoulders, stiff jaw tight, trying to look older than he was. Mr. Webb, Miriam began. Do you understand the charge? He nodded, eyes locked forward. Yes, ma'am. Do you want to tell me what happened? A long pause, then he spoke. My baby sister needed formula. My mom's SNAP card ran out, and we were going to get more in 2 days. I wasn't thinking. I just didn't want her to go without. His voice didn't tremble. It didn't have to. The truth was steady enough. Miriam took a breath. Shoplifting is a serious offense, she said, but so is hunger. I'm assigning you to a diversion program, 40 hours of community service, 2 counseling sessions, and a written reflection. If completed, this charge will be dismissed and sealed. Julian looked stunned. His mother mouthed thank you through tears. Miriam didn't smile, but her expression softened. Everyone makes mistakes, she added. The difference is what you do with the second chance. As court adjourned, the clerk leaned in and whispered, You've been different lately. Miriam glanced up surprised. Different? How? Just, you're watching people now, not just processing them. Miriam didn't answer. She just gathered her notes and walked back to chambers, where the folder on Elias Monroe still waited neatly closed, but ever present. 2 days later, her phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number. This is Elias Monroe. I hope it's all right that I reached out directly. Miriam replied quickly. Of course. The message came back, I've been invited to speak at the Southwest Justice Roundtable next month. Topic: authority and assumption. If you're attending, I'd welcome the chance to connect. She stared at the message for a long moment, then replied, I'll be there. Not as a judge, just someone still learning how to listen. A pause, then his final reply. Those are the best ones. That evening, she walked out of the courthouse just after sunset. The desert sky was pink and orange shadows long on the pavement. She passed a janitor sweeping near the steps, nodded, and for the first time in years asked his name. Manny, he said, surprised. Thanks for all you do, Manny, she replied, meaning every word. When she got to her car, she didn't immediately start the engine. She sat for a while, radio off, thinking. Her courtroom hadn't changed its rules, but it had changed its posture. It no longer leaned away from the people inside it. It leaned in. The next week, a defense attorney she'd known for years approached her outside the elevator. Whatever you're doing, he said, it's working. I haven't seen this kind of courtroom energy since, I don't know when. Miriam nodded, not dismissively, but thoughtfully. I just stopped assuming I already knew everything before the case began. He chuckled. That's a rare admission, Judge. Not rare, she said quietly. Just overdue. At the roundtable event 2 weeks later, she sat in the second row. Elias Monroe took the podium with the same calm authority she remembered from her courtroom. He didn't speak loudly, he didn't speak long, but the room hung on his words. Power doesn't have to shout, he said. It just has to be present. Assumptions fill the gaps when we stop being curious. And justice without curiosity is just paperwork. Miriam sat with her arms folded across her lap, heart still. When the panel ended, she approached him. You were right, she said. About all of it. He gave a slight smile. You were listening, he said. That's more than I expected. She smiled back softly, sincerely. I'm still listening. And this time she meant it. Sometimes the most powerful changes in our lives don't come from dramatic moments or loud confrontations. They come from the quiet realization that we've stopped seeing people clearly. Judge Miriam Callaway built her entire career on precision, structure, and efficiency. She believed justice meant keeping the courtroom moving, ruling quickly, and never looking back. But one morning, a man named Elias Monroe, calm, composed, and deeply dignified, walked into her courtroom and reminded her without raising his voice that being right isn't the same as doing right. The lesson from this story is simple, yet profound. Justice isn't a system, it's a relationship. It's about the people in front of us. The clerk holding back tears, the teenager too afraid to speak, the mother who's just trying to hold it all together. We all move so fast, judges, teachers, neighbors, parents, that we forget to pause and ask why. We forget to look up. But when we do, something shifts. And it's not weakness, it's clarity. Elias didn't demand an apology. He didn't challenge authority with anger or resentment. He simply stood in his truth. And in doing so, he invited change. The kind that lingers. The kind that doesn't just fix a moment, it reshapes how someone leads from then on. So here's our encouragement to you. Whether you hold a title, a responsibility, or simply a voice in someone's life, lead with awareness. Speak with kindness. And don't underestimate the power of presence, because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm in a world that expects you to shout. And sometimes the most transformative thing you can offer is a second chance. To every listener who joined us for this story, thank you. At US Instructive Stories, we believe in telling stories that don't just entertain, but invite reflection. Stories that speak to dignity, accountability, and humanity. If this story moved you, if it made you think or pause or see someone in your life a little differently, we hope you'll carry that with you. Share it. Talk about it. Ask more questions. And above all, look up. There are more stories to tell, more people worth seeing, and more truth found in silence than we sometimes realize. We appreciate you for being part of this journey, and we hope you'll stay with us for the next story and the next lesson. Thank you for watching.